Hi everyone. We'll get started, and before we officially get started with this roundtable, I have the pleasure to introduce you to the moderator, the person who's accepted to moderate our roundtable discussion today, and that's Ahmouda Ben Ahmouda. Ahmouda is a public affairs and program officer at Equal Voice, and Equal Voice is one of our non-academic partners. So we're really happy and excited that one of our non-academic partners is involved in the conference in this way. So thanks a lot for accepting to doing this and for taking the lead on moderating our discussion today. So Ahmouda, on to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Ruth. And thank you for having me. Bonjour tout le monde. I'm really excited to be here. Like you said, I work with Equal Voice, so we're a nonprofit committed to electing more women in Canada. And I also have a political science background, so I'm particularly excited to hear from our panelists today. So I'll start by introducing our panelists in the order that they appear on my screen. First, we have Professor Elizabeth Goodyear-Grant. She's an associate professor of political science at Queen's University and director of the Canadian Opinion Research Archive. Her research focuses on gender, elections, and representation. So the next person on my screen is Professor Kassra Oskooii. He is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Delaware. So he's joining us from the States, and he's a researcher who focuses on the political behavior of ethnic and racial minority groups, with particular focus on Muslims in the West. And last but not least, we have Professor Erin Tolley, who is the Canadian Research Chair in Gender, Race, and Inclusive Politics, and Associate Professor of Political Science at Carleton University. Her research examines the relationship between socio-demographic diversity and politics in Canada, and she's the author of the book, Framed Media and Coverage of Race in Canadian Politics. So all relevant researchers and professors today. And we can start with the questions, Ruth, I believe, correct? Awesome. So before we start, I just want to make sure that everyone's mics are muted, just so we can hear our panelists. And we will have 30 minutes of Q&A at the very end from the audience. For our panelists, I'll raise my hand just as subtly as I could, just to let you know that it's time, and that way we can give everyone the chance to speak. So we'll start with our first question. It is, what evidence do we have that descriptive diverse representation in politics helps democratic societies function better, and what dimensions of that? So I'll direct that question to Elizabeth.
Perfect. Thank you, Amen, and thanks everybody for inviting me. I'm really happy to be participating in your conference. So that's a great question, and a question that motivates a lot of the research in the area. I guess if we sort of think about the question a bit, I think it depends what we mean by function better in society, and which we can talk about. But I would also argue that better descriptive representation of diverse groups is itself an outcome of well-functioning societies, right? So it is itself, regardless of what outputs or effects it has, it is on its own an effect that contributes to, or that is part of, a definition of a better functioning society. So I would view it as a fulfillment of the requirement of democracy, especially representative democracy. And a fair bit of the literature, I think rests on this idea. I also think that democracies are not functioning all that well right now at all, actually. So the onus isn't, I mean, maybe this is a bit strong, but I don't think the onus is on marginalized groups to demonstrate that their inclusion will result in better function of society, or that they deserve a greater presence in politics, right? So I guess I'm wondering if, like, there's a sort of a different way of thinking about this type of question, right? In general, the framing of descriptive representation and the underrepresentation of diverse groups is something that has been increasingly tackled in the literature. So one really good example, which some people may have come across, is Rainbow Murray's 2014 piece in the APSR, where she argues for a reframing of the quota debate and quota-oriented literature to focus on men and the overrepresentation of men. So she sort of flips the narrative here to say that this will help correct the unintended consequences of framing men as the norm and women as the other. And we could extend this to other groups too, racialized minorities, Indigenous people, and so on, right? So in relation to sex and gender, she says that with men's presence already accepted as the status quo, the burden of proof for justifying presence lie with the outsiders wishing to enter politics rather than with those already present in excessive numbers. And goes on to say that men are required neither to prove their competence nor justify their inclusion. So that's a sort of like a pitch for reframing our thinking about diverse representation. The other thing that, just to kick off the discussion and to which my co-panelists will jump into as well here, I would note too that backsliding on gender equality is taking place in many jurisdictions, despite an increased representation of women in politics. So, I mean, that sort of poses an interesting question or puzzle for the question that we're addressing first on the panel. So for example, we have growing threats to bodily autonomy for women, like on abortion rights, but also things like the proposed and enactment of veil bans and burqa bans across many countries over the past, I don't know, decade, I suppose. And in general, we see growth in illiberal politics and rhetoric with the rise of far-right and alt-right governments and parties and so on. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that actually sometimes with the increased representation of diverse groups, this sort of coincides with the rise of illiberal politics and illiberal policies. And sometimes that is actually like the direct result of backlash against the growing presence of diverse groups in society and growing a status threat among dominant groups and so on. So anyway, that's a lot of points from me. So maybe I'll stop here and see if my panelists want to come in on this.
Awesome. Thank you, Elizabeth. Kassra or Erin, would you like to take a stab at the first question also?
Yeah, definitely. You know, and I want to preface to say that, you know, I'm an Americanist in terms of my training, focused on political behavior of racial and ethnic minorities. So I will bring that lens into this discussion. I think Elizabeth did a fabulous talk talking about some of the findings that I won't be talking about. But when thinking of descriptive representation, you know, I think of its effects on at least two dimensions, you know, policy advocacy and outcomes, and the political behavior, the effects it has on the political behavior of citizens. And, you know, we can't, you know, automatically, of course, assume that descriptive representation always translates into substantive representation, but there's, you know, really good evidence that it does. You know, if we go back to some classic work by Catherine Tate, you know, she shows that, you know, Black American Democrats have legislative records that are quite distinct from the policy records of white Democrats. You know, often sponsoring symbolic legislation that confers special recognition to persons or groups, but also initiate policies of substance, namely that those that redistribute tangible public goods in a fair manner. Now, there have been other studies showing that minority legislatures are also more likely to advance minority interests, even in contexts where there are weak electoral incentives to do so. You know, as David Brockman put it in his APSR article, you know, is that, you know, minority representatives are intrinsically motivated to help their co-ethnics compared to white representatives in similarly situated contexts. There's also convincing causal evidence that state legislatures are on average less responsive to the demands and preferences of minority constituents compared to white ones. Essentially, they discriminate against minorities, whereas co-ethnic legislatures do not. Now, when thinking about policy, others have asked if minority lawmakers are interchangeable with white lawmakers, particularly if we look at majority minority district where you have similar liberal or conservative leaning legislatures. And on this front, looking at roll call votes, the evidence suggests that the presence of more Latino and Black state legislators, obviously in the context of US, is associated with more liberal representation. So they are not interchangeable. And finally, you know, when I talked about effects on voters, on citizens, and what the research on that side shows that, you know, descriptive representation can improve assessments of the political system in terms of the level of fairness and equity. It can increase political efficacy and to some degree, political knowledge and interest in politics when you have a descriptive representative. And it's also associated with lower levels of self-reported alienation from the political system, particularly if we look at groups such as Latinos, and this is where Gary Segura's work comes in. And there's some evidence that co-ethnic candidates, even in the context of Canada, can increase turnout levels and motivate various racial and ethnic minority groups to participate in politics. So I will end it there and just highlight again that the benefits are on both sides. And if there are other comments, I'm happy to listen to.
Awesome. Thank you, Kassra, for your input. I'm already taking notes. So thank you both. The next question is, are some institutional designs correlated with higher levels of inclusion? And what evidence is there of causal mechanisms in these design choices? So Erin, I'll give you the first stab at this question.
Thanks very much, and thanks for having us. I mean, just one follow-up point on this first question. I mean, Kassra and Elizabeth both talked about many instrumental reasons that you would want more descriptive representation, but I think there's also a moral reason. So often, you know, we're sort of forced to make this like business case for diversity and you know, how would more diversity make society function better or operate better? But there's also a moral argument, and you know, I'll talk about that a little bit in terms of institutions. We have a tendency to regard institutions as neutral, but obviously most of our political institutions were designed originally by propertied white men for propertied white men to protect those interests. And so I think there's a moral argument to be made about descriptive representation and thinking about institutions in that context. So, you know, in terms of institutional design, we know that, for example, representation within parties and among leaders, it does make a difference to more inclusion. If you look, for example, at parties that have made commitments to diversify candidate slates, the NDP is a good example of that. They've had a long time affirmative action policy that commits them to federally in federal ridings to nominate at least 40% of their candidates from equity groups, and they have historically done a fairly good job when it comes to the nomination of women candidates. But it was not until Jagmeet Singh became leader that they actually started to make widespread advances on the nomination of racialized candidates. So for many years, their proportion of racialized candidates was not that much better, and in some cases worse than the liberals and conservatives. But when Jagmeet Singh became leader, you know, you saw a real concerted effort to nominate more candidates. And I think there's a variety, you know, if we think through the mechanisms behind that, I think there's a few at play. One, I think that Jagmeet Singh had a different sort of network than leaders of the NDP prior to that. He had deeper roots within racialized communities. He had some credibility within those communities. I think there's some role model effects with candidates believing that a party that is led by a racialized leader, that there is a real commitment. It's not a tokenistic commitment to diversity, that this is a real commitment. And this is a party where they can be included, not just as faces in the photo op, but as people with voices. And then I think also you saw some turnover in riding association presidents. And so there is some evidence that the riding association presidents and the people that are involved at the local riding level, the diversity of actors at that level can influence who is ultimately recruited to run. So Christine Chang and Margaret Tabbitts have found this when it comes to women candidates, and I found this in my own work on racialized candidates. And I think that diversity at the top, it generates different kinds of networks, signals, messages, and also some thinking, it activates a sort of group consciousness that might not be there if leadership looks different. I mean, the other institution that we sometimes think about is electoral reform, and that often comes up. And I think that's a really interesting question that maybe we can return to in the question and answer. But there's often this idea that electoral reform will solve this problem, that if we adopted proportional representation, then you would see more women and Indigenous and racialized officials in Canada. And I mean, from my perspective, the evidence is somewhat unclear, I think, and I think there could actually be opposing results for women compared to Indigenous and racialized candidates. In some ways, the sort of geographic concentration of racialized and Indigenous populations in Canada, that's one mechanism that has helped to increase the proportion of Indigenous and racialized legislators. And so, I mean, that's a really interesting, from a question of institutional design, some of the mechanisms that might lead to increased gender representation may in fact depress the representation of other underrepresented or marginalized group. And so I think when we're thinking about institutional mechanisms, that's really important. And just the final thing on institutional design, I think we really have to think about, about this question of institutional neutrality. And a lot of the research in this area comes at the question of underrepresentation from a deficit model. Like there must be something wrong with women, or there must be something wrong with racialized or Indigenous candidates that they can't get elected. So, you see this argument that women lack political ambition, or immigrant Canadians are apathetic about Canadian politics. They only care about politics in their home countries. And I think you sort of have to reverse that question and say, well, why is it that people might not want to get involved in these institutions? What about them is not hospitable? And I think that comes back to this very question of who designed the institutions and for whom.
Awesome, thank you, Erin. And it's always important to remember that racialized peoples and Indigenous peoples are not a monolithic group. So it's definitely, we have to adapt in that way. Kassra, would you like to give us maybe the US perspective on this question?
Yeah, 100%. And thank you, Erin. So I always think about, when thinking about institutional design, one of the simple questions we can ask is voting sufficient to ensure representation? And that ties in with the first question. And the answer really is not if your preferred candidate can never win. And here, on this front, what I like to highlight in the context of US and electoral system effects is paying attention to local politics in the United States, which often is overlooked. Local politics is so important because local governments provide so many critical services for their residents, for their everyday lives. Think about school boards and city councils. And what's happening in the context of US is that there is convincing evidence and numerous successful court challenges that went all the way up to the US Supreme Court, which have shown that multi-member districts or at-large systems in which you have 10 candidates running for a school board, top 3 or top 4 vote getters win a seat, in combination with a racially polarized voting environment, can certainly dilute the strength of minority voters to the point where minority groups comprising between 20 to 45% of the citizen voting age population cannot even get their preferred candidate elected on a 7-member school board if you look for over 40 years, just because they have an at-large system and you're in an environment in which white voters are unwilling to support and put their votes behind minority candidates. And so when thinking about fair representation, we have to think about election system, not in just in terms of access to voting and how many barriers are set in front of different populations. In the US, we talked about the effect of voter ID laws or long lines that we have or limited polling stations, which discourage people from coming out and turning out, voting for their preferred candidate. But what I want to also highlight is that we have to look at electoral designs that can shut out those in the numerical minority. And one way to ensure fair representation, particularly when we look at these local elections that are so consequential to the everyday lives of people, particularly in racially polarized environments. And by the way, don't just think of the South of the United States when you think of racially polarized. We have racially polarized voting in the state of New York, in school districts in New York. You'll be astonished if I show you some of the election outcomes and how whites and Black Americans are voting completely for different candidates in even nonpartisan elections and school boards. So one way to fix that is change the electoral structure. And one thing that has been suggested in the context of US is creating majority minority or influenced districts. And that's certainly something that the courts have recommended. This will at least ensure a voice on the table, right? It won't necessarily result in translation into desired policy outcomes, but at least a voice on the table.
Thank you for your input, Kassra. Elizabeth, would you like to add to that question?
Yeah, for sure. I just want to, I guess, talk for 1 or 2 minutes about beyond the election stage and some of the some of the research on institutional design that is coming up in the context of ensuring fair representation, right? So a lot of the literature does focus on like electoral systems and voting laws and, laws around candidacy and so on. But then there is also this other literature which is focusing, and increasingly so, on the conditions that diverse groups face once they've been elected. And so you see, for example, a lot of feminist institutionalist literature on the design of parliamentary work and increasing calls for making parliamentary work more amenable to the lives of women and other diverse groups. And so, calling for things like remote voting and proxy voting, remote and hybrid sittings of parliaments, the elimination of night sittings of parliaments, and so on. And one of the interesting things about the current context is that because of COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of legislatures were forced to adopt these innovations because they can't meet in parliaments together. And so Canada has been using a hybrid sitting arrangement since last year. And it'll be interesting to see what insight can come from that for designing a better parliament that is more conducive to not only like recruiting and drawing women into legislative roles, but also keeping them there and facilitating their movement through the political career to reach executive positions, and so on, right? So that's a really important thing too. And not just for women as well, right? Like anything in parliamentary work that can decrease the onerous burdens of travel, for example, will assist in the recruitment and election and the holding on to representatives from like certain disabled communities and other communities as well. So we need to focus as well on the representative institutions that we're electing people into. And then another point on that too is one of the most important and most recent reforms to the work of parliaments is the adoption of members' codes of conduct around things like sexual and workplace harassment and so on. And here in Canada, for example, Tracy Rainey and Cheryl Collier have been doing really excellent work looking at the adoption in 2015 of a member-to-member code of conduct in Canada. So Canada was the first among Westminster parliaments to adopt this in 2015, and a few others have followed suit since, and they have been analyzing from a feminist institutionalist perspective, analyzing the content of the rules and comparing them with other parliaments' rules as well. And they're raising a lot of red flags about the limited scope of these rules, the fact that a lot of the investigation and finding of solutions to workplace harassment in parliament is still left in party hands and so on. So this is definitely something to watch for in terms of the work and the life of legislators, right? Legislators face a lot of obstacles doing their work, and that's especially so for legislators from underrepresented groups.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth, for your input. It's definitely always worth mentioning that it's great when we get women and marginalized groups to the gate, but then if they decide to not run because of the culture and politics and stuff, what good are our efforts, right? So our next question, we kind of established that institutions are not, to an extent, designed to accommodate women and marginalized groups. So the next question is, what does the research say about strategies for underrepresented groups to get their voices heard when institutions fail? And is there evidence about the relative efficacy of these strategies? And perhaps to be a bit more precise, do these strategies differ from one minority group to another? So whoever would like to start with that question, perhaps Kassra?
Sure. Yeah, definitely. This is a big question. It's an excellent question. It's a big question. So, you know, we've been talking about voting so far, and certainly, I mean, it goes without saying that voting is very important in many countries. And if you have paid attention to anything about the U.S. presidential election, we know that how important voting was in the state of Georgia, with the Black turnout essentially giving President Biden, you know, an anticipated victory, and Latinos turning out for Biden in Arizona after 25 years of Democrat wins in Arizona. But the question is, when some of the mainstream paths of political power are closed or ineffective in bringing about substantive change, various groups have pushed for equality and civil rights outside the existing institutional arrangements. You know, because what if you perceive that institutions have failed you, are unresponsive to your needs, or completely biased? That's when people resort to demonstration and protest. And when we go back and look at the classic civil rights movement in the US in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, we start to see that, you know, factions emerge between prominent Black civil rights leaders. You know, Martin Luther King, you know, he wanted to bring change mostly from within the system, right? You know, the action of civil disobedience, get Black people registered and to vote, presumably to bring about additional rights, civil rights. But then you had people like Malcolm X, who, you know, did not believe that Black people can bring about change from within institutions or existing arrangement that so advantage white Americans. So Malcolm X had a separationist bent. Now, when looking at protest behavior, many prominent scholars such as Daniel Gillen have argued that protests translate into political change through the communication of protesters to non-protesters. And communication and framing of the issues, it's just so vital to the success or failures of different movements. Now, in my own work, I have shown that one of the reasons the protest movement against Donald Trump's Muslim travel ban executive order was so effective in changing or shifting public opinion against it in literally mere days. We're talking about, 72 hours, is that protesters were able to convincingly highlight the incompatibility of this sort of ban with core American values of equality and religious liberty. So they won the framing war to the point where almost all the counter narrative in favor of the ban was this backpedaling from the Trump administration that, this is not a Muslim ban, rather than trying to explain why this executive order was needed in the first place. So when we think about protest tactics, we can think of Omar Wasso's recently published piece in the APSR suggesting that nonviolent protests, particularly when met with state or vigilante repression, can drive media coverage and change framing in favor of protesters, and then can help shift public opinion when it comes to civil rights. So framing is so vital. The words that we choose to describe our objectives and different groups have done is so vital. Finally, I want to talk about some contemporary protest movements. I mean, we know the effects of Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movement, and we can really see how protests can be used as a viable strategy to hold public officials and bad actors accountable, right? And just a few days ago, in my country, in the United States, we had ex-police officer Derek Chauvin in Minnesota was convicted of the murder of Mr. George Floyd for having suffocated him by placing his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. Now, many have argued that this conviction, unprecedented conviction, I'll tell you why it's unprecedented, would have not have happened if the protesters had not put tremendous pressure on the city and the state to put together a strong prosecution team to bring about second-degree murder charges, which is unprecedented in the state of Minnesota against a police officer. And in fact, what is noteworthy is that Chauvin is the first ever police officer in the history of the state. Think about it, history of the state, to ever have been convicted of a second-degree murder charge. So in this case, then, we can see how protest activity can not only be effective in terms of perhaps policy outcomes, expansion of rights, but also putting pressure on elected officials to hold various bad actors accountable.
Great. Thank you for that perspective, Kassra. Erin or Elizabeth, would you like to follow up on that?
Sure, I will. I mean, so we've been focusing on elected institutions and like legislatures and electoral systems and stuff, but it's certainly, in both of our countries, Canada and the US, when marginalized groups face blockages at that level, right, in elections and legislatures, historically and today, people engage in venue shopping too, right? So like protest is one avenue, but then there's also institutional venue shopping too, where, the courts can be accessed, although that is extremely costly. And so it's not exactly democratic or fair in terms of which groups get access to the courts or whatever, but that's a really important avenue for representation in Canada and the US especially. And the research, a lot of the research, if we sort of link it to, because this is our area for some of us, political behavior, we show too that not only can the courts produce progressive outcomes for groups, but they can also have persuasive effects on populations, right? So in Canada, one of my favorite papers on this is Scott Matthews' same-sex marriage paper, where he puts together some pretty compelling data to show that the sequence of cases around same-sex marriage that the Canadian Supreme Court presided over the span of like a decade shifted opinion on the matter. And that's, you know, that's really sort of intuitive as well, given the political independence of the court in Canada. Now that's maybe a slight difference with the US, the perceived independence of the court, but also the expertise of the court. So, you know, they were, this added to their credibility on the issue. And then both Canada and the US too, being federal countries, right? When groups are shut out from, you know, one level or order of government, they can always take it to like the subnational level, and that's always been, I mean, at least in Canada, that's always been especially an option for groups that are seeking policy change around social services in the welfare state, which jurisdictionally are, you know, more in the provincial domain than the federal domain. So, you know, I mean, it doesn't produce really democratic or fair outcomes because it requires a lot of resources too to spread, you know, to do advocacy across many different jurisdictions. But at least it, you know, the opportunity structure in Canada at least presents multiple entry points for political influence.
I mean, I think there's also an interesting, as I listen to Elizabeth and Kassra, I mean, it makes me think of the position of Indigenous peoples in Canada. In a lot of cases, you know, there's been a movement by Indigenous peoples to simply exit the state because they haven't found that any of these venues have really been necessarily avenues to have their voices heard. I mean, in the 2015 election, there was definitely a movement among Indigenous peoples to use voting as one of these potential ways of you know, accessing power, and there was a strong encouragement to increase voter turnout among Indigenous peoples, and there's some evidence that that effort benefited Justin Trudeau and the Liberals, with Indigenous peoples turning out in, you know, historically larger numbers to vote for that party. But there is then, you saw sort of a dissatisfaction with that particular strategy when there is a recognition that some of the promises that had been made were not necessarily going to come to fruition. So promises about safe water in Indigenous territories, many of those have not yet been met, in part, the government says, because of the pandemic. Many of the calls to action related to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission have not been addressed. And then the treatment of Jody Wilson-Raybould, an Indigenous member of Trudeau's cabinet, sort of left a lot of Indigenous peoples with the, you know, the impression that even when they do organize to try to have their voices heard through these formal arenas, they're still met with resistance. And as Kassra was talking about some of the strategies that have been used in the States, it's interesting that Indigenous peoples have tried some of those strategies as well. So for example, around natural resource extraction, last February, in February 2020, in response to the building of the Coastal Gas Link, Wet'suwet'en land defenders blocked and their allies blocked rail lines, but shortly thereafter that was disbanded and the construction on the gas line continues. And in fact, what's even more endangering consequences in the context of a pandemic, where there are now camps of natural resource workers being erected in traditional territories, and in some cases causing transmission of COVID to the Indigenous communities around them. And so, I mean, it's really, it seems like to me a a thorny problem, because, you know, the question asks, you know, what can underrepresented groups do to get their voices heard? And I almost think it needs to be flipped to like, what do institutions need to do in order to listen? Because it seems to me that the problem isn't necessarily about, you know, groups not using the right strategies to be heard, but rather institutions being shut off to them, institutions not being willing to listen, and, you know, people in majority groups similarly not being willing to listen either.
Thank you, Erin. So we're right on time for the last question before we move on to the Q&A. So what are the challenges and opportunities of growing diversity in Canada, particularly in the study of politics? So just so we're even speaking time, perhaps Kassra, you'd like to start?
Sure. Well, I'll start. I'll defer to my Canadian colleagues on the Canada front, who are the experts. So I will just say just a little bit, because I know people would hopefully like to ask questions. But I start saying that, you know, there's a good amount of evidence that diversity, inclusion, and equity makes some people in privileged or advantaged positions very nervous. And we have seen this around the world. With the rise of alt-right movements in countries such as Germany, France, Poland, UK, just to name a few. Again, I'll let my Canadian colleagues talk about Canada, and certainly the United States. When we think about the emergence of the Tea Party movement, and certainly Donald J. Trump and his Make America Great slogan. Now, research has shown fairly convincingly, based on that's my opinion, that the rise of these factions is closely related to status threat. The perception that, you know, life as we know it is disappearing, that the power and advantage that we have always had will go away. So some, in my opinion, again, I don't want to offend any scholars who have made that kind of argument, I think have unsuccessfully argued that the rise of Trump is related to economic anxiety, okay? And I think economic anxiety, with all due respect, is window dressing to hide the concerns that people have about demographic change in the US and other countries and the loss of status. It's really about the realization that one's unearned advantages may suddenly disappear. Now we have to compete on equal footing. And perhaps we have to now become a more democratic and pluralistic society that just doesn't cater to the needs and desires of the status quo. And this realization is really, I think, why we're seeing, it's no accident, why we're seeing, as the expansion of rights continues, we're seeing this backlash and this resistance in the US and other countries. So I will obviously allow Elizabeth and Erin to talk about Canada.
Erin or Elizabeth, would you like to go ahead? Certainly this issue is not foreign to Canada, so we definitely have something to say about this.
I can go, because my point actually builds directly off of Kassra's point. I agree 100% with what you're saying, Kassra, and I think it's causing what I think is one of the biggest problems for fair representation of marginalized groups right now in terms of recruitment and election, but also their longevity inside institutions. And that's growing levels of violence and abuse towards marginalized populations who enter politics or who are currently in politics. And it relates to just the growing overall sort of like the growing toxicity in public debate, driven in part, I guess, by partisan polarization, but lots of other factors as well. The growing attention to violence and abuse in politics is sort of indicative of this, and it ranges from online abuse, right, on social media and other venues, but all the way up to physical violence against women and other underrepresented groups, right? I mean, you've seen that in the United States with the shooting of Gabby Gifford and the plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan, and the killing in the UK of Joe Cox, a Labour MP. And I mean, one of the stories of Justin Trudeau's parity cabinet has been the relentless abuse that women and racialized members of the cabinet have received on social media, and sometimes also from media, like official media, and also their colleagues at times, right? So not only does this pose grave risk sometimes to their life and well-being, including their mental well-being, but it has the potential to have a major chilling effect on future recruitment and election of diverse representatives, as well as to relate to your earlier points about the behavioral effects of more fair representation in politics. If the election of members of diverse groups has a mobilizing effect on their co-ethnics or the members of their gender or sex group, I mean, and there is some research on this like coming out already, the abuse of them in politics probably has a demobilizing effect, right? It sends the message that, you know, people like you are not welcome in politics. So I think those two go hand in hand. The status threat is causing a backlash against members of underrepresented groups. And it's not just elected members either. Actually, we could sort of, I mean, if we look at some of the recent work that's come out, so like Monalina Crook, for example, has a book out last year on violence against women in politics. And her argument is that this is against, like, the abuse is growing against public women broadly conceived, and that would include appointed officials, journalists, activists, and other women in the public eye. And the same would be true of other members of marginalized groups as well. So.
I mean, I thought about this question just in terms of like the study of politics, and that's maybe the point I would pick up. I mean, I think one of the challenges we have to studying diversity in politics is still in Canada and maybe elsewhere, but I mean, certainly in Canada, data is one of the challenges to studying this area. So, I mean, in a lot of cases, we lack good data on that are desegregated into various group identities. I mean, the Canadian Canada Elections Study, it has a question about ethnicity, but it has not until this year included a question about race. I mean, that kind of data limitation influences what we can know about different groups. Often we have information on, you know, a macro category like visible minority, but it's not broken down into other groups, even though we know that the political experiences of, you know, South Asian Canadians, for example, are dramatically different than that of Black Canadians. And so, I mean, one of the challenges we face in Canada is that we don't have great data on some of these questions, not to mention, you know, other identity groups like people with disabilities or LGBTQ Canadians. We just lack some data, you know, that allow us to study this. So, you know, there have been efforts now to increase the data we have on candidate diversity, and Semra Sevi has done some of that work. But still, this is not institutionalized. Every election cycle, there's sort of this scramble just to figure out how many diverse Canadians are running for public office. I mean, that is a huge gap, and that poses a real challenge to the study of diversity. And I think it extends to our own discipline. I mean, there is not a lot, you know, there's not a significant focus still on race in Canadian politics. Certainly there are scholars that have studied, other dimensions of identity like ethnicity, or language or region. But when it comes to the study of Indigenous peoples or racialized Canadians, there's far less focus on that. And I mean, people still cite Deb Thompson's 2008 CJPS article that asks, is race political? And I think there's still sort of a debate about whether or not it makes sense to study race in Canada. And when you look at, some of the metrics for, kind of how we indicate or how we sort of value research in the discipline. If you look, for example, at the winners of the Donald Smiley Prize that recognizes the best books in Canadian government and politics, most of those are still on institutional topics, like the Crown or Parliament. There are very few of them on so-called diversity topics. Most of the winners have been, white men. And that's just sort of, I think, an indication of the type of work that tends to be prioritized in the discipline. And I think it also sends a signal to the students we're training about what Canadian politics is actually about. And if they are looking at those kinds of metrics, they might have this sense that, inquiry about race or about indigeneity is not sort of the bread and butter of Canadian politics. And I think that partly is a process. I mean, certainly, gender went through this sort of similar, trying to mainstream gender into Canadian politics. And I think that there have been some successes there. Certainly there are universities that offer gender and politics as a core field. You can do it as a core field. And so I think there's some movement there, but there's still, I think, within our own discipline, some of the shortcomings that we as political scientists recognize in democratic institutions, such as a lack of representation. Those shortcomings occur in our own discipline. We have not achieved descriptive representation in our own departments. The mechanisms that we use to hire and to promote and to assign merit pay are not exactly transparent nor accountable. So some of the things that we recognize in the democracies that we study as being problematic, we actually reproduce them within our own institution. And to me, that's a challenge to the study of diversity. It's not just like this external challenge, but even within the work that we do and the questions that we value and the data that we have available to us to answer these questions. I think we need to reflect on that as well.
That's an excellent answer. Thank you so much, Erin, for that input. So we're right on time to actually start the Q&A. The way I suggest we do this is maybe by hand raising in the Zoom button, and you can unmute yourself and ask the question. If you're more comfortable, you can also just put it in the chat, and I'm happy to say the question out loud. So perhaps I'll give everyone 30 seconds to pose their question. All right, so I see Ruth's hand is raised. Ruth, would you like to ask your question unmuted?
Yeah. First of all, thanks for a great discussion. I learned a lot just listening to you and thinking about all of this. I've got one question that is sort of the talk is obviously putting a lot on the table that is worrisome and really troublesome, I'd say. And it's sort of, if you see the links between the different elements that you've mentioned, we know that there's increasing diversity in societies. And we know that it would be great if that was represented in politics, but it's not quite. But we're seeing societies increasingly diverse, we also know that there's a backlash against that, that there's this threat, and that is pushing people to vote against minority candidates, for example, or to pick populist leaders or radical right-wing parties. And then we also know that that is demotivating minority candidates to still show up. So it starts to look like a vicious circle to me. And I'm hoping that you can help me to sort of be a bit more optimistic by pointing to things that might perhaps break that vicious circle. Is it really going to be vicious circle? Is there ways to break that sort of diversity leading to backlash, and that is just demobilizing those people, and those people are just going to give up at some point because they're not going to get their voices heard in any ways?
Elizabeth, I know not to put you on the spot, but I know you touched on that quite a bit. If you would like to answer.
Yeah, that's a hard question, because a lot of the backlash is expressed in ways that are not in the control of any institution or body, right? So like, how can you limit the amount of hate a candidate is exposed to on Twitter? Although, I mean, I guess that those debates are being had, right? And like the banning of Donald Trump from Twitter, as an example, shows us that not only is this possible to cut off sources of hate, but it demonstrates that these companies are, I mean, it's a sort of admission that there's a responsibility to help contribute in some ways responsibly to public debate while also not cutting off expression. So I'll just say that a lot of what we're talking about, because it's cultural and it occurs outside of formal institutions of politics, it's tough. But I think so, I mean, if we're talking about institutions, some of the things I was making reference to can help, right? So like, you know, if I just go back to a couple of my earlier comments around, you know, revising how the work of Parliament is done, or bringing in maybe revised codes of conduct for MPs' behavior towards each other. And there would be, like, there are other options as well too. But if these things were maybe sort of beefed up a bit, I mean, because just by the way, Tracy Rainey and Cheryl Collier's research finds that these are mostly pretty toothless and ineffective, and may actually act as window dressing to suggest that parliaments are doing something and that things are becoming more gender or racially balanced or fair, when in fact they're not. But if these were revised to really take seriously the issues that legislators face around abuse or toxicity in politics, then not only would it make the working lives of people already in politics better, but more importantly, it would send signals, right? I mean, the political system needs to do more things and to send stronger signals to those who may be eligible or interested in political representation, like acting as a political representative in the future. Although, I mean, some people would criticize my response as being too conservative, right? In the sense of I'm talking about tinkering to some extent with institutions that may be deeply flawed and that are cannot be designed well to accommodate, not accommodate, but to reflect the full diversity and to fairly treat members and the different groups of people who want fair representation. So I just, by way of kicking us off, those are some thoughts.
Yeah, I think this is an excellent question, Ruth. And, you know, I guess I'm a little bit more optimistic in saying that, you know, we're not stuck in a vicious cycle. And if you look at, you know, just historically, at least in the context of the US with the expansion of rights for different groups, sure, there's always backlash, you know, from, you know, post-Civil War in the US, you know, expansion of voting with the 14th, 15th, and 16th Amendment. And then you had Jim Crow laws in the US where tried to essentially, through various tactics and intimidation, prevent Black Americans from voting. But eventually, if we look through history, and I always ask this to my students, you know, has the US become more democratic over time, despite backlashes? It's hard to argue that no, we are the same US as 200 years ago, right? So there is a little bit of positivity in that we are trending in the right direction despite tremendous backlashes. What I worry about personally is when there is no visible backlash. Because when there is no visible backlash, it suggests politics is as normal and politics as status quo, rather than investigating what's wrong with our current climate. So, you know, I think, and even just, you know, by the way, I want to say, you know, thank you for inviting me, and the fact that you even put together a panel to talk about these issues. Maybe 20 years ago, there was no such a panel. Suggests that we're trending perhaps in the right direction, again, despite the backlash. But politics as normal, and Erin warned me not to say this about Canada, you know, because, you know, and she said she's going to defriend me on all social media platforms. And I said, you know, don't give the stereotype that Canada, things are better in Canada, you know, in terms of race relations, because, you know, you look at the US, it's like all in your face, kind of like all the stuff happening with MAGA, Make America Great Again, and all these things we're having. But maybe sometimes it could be worse if the backlash is hidden or not visible, because then you're not actually paying attention to address any problems. I guess I'll allow Erin to speak at that. I just could have put her on the spot.
Yeah, I'm busy unfriending you at the moment. I'll say, but I mean, I think that it's a really good point, like what you're talking about, backlash. I mean, and I think that is in some ways, it's a hurdle in Canada to get, you know, people who sort of just average Canadians to take seriously the idea that there might be a problem, that perhaps our democratic institutions are not as inclusive or equitable as they could be, and that's often because we are conveniently able to make this comparison to a neighbor to the south, where you know, where it seems like the problems are much bigger. But it's interesting in that, I mean, the sort of flip side of that is, you know, when things do happen in the States, though, it does actually activate, you know, a reaction in Canada. So there were protests in Canada about George Floyd's killing. There, you know, movement around Black Lives Matter, like that happened here as well. When Donald Trump talked about a Muslim ban, you know, that did activate sort of a sense in Canada, that not so much that this could happen here. I think people still kind of have this sense that it won't, but there's now sort of this, there is some recognition, I think, that some of that discourse like creeps across the border, because we get all of, you know, all American news channels, and, you know, we can watch Fox News here if we wish. And so that sort of creeps across the border too. And I mean, I think it's a really good point you make about backlash. And in one sense, like, backlash sounds negative, but maybe that's sort of like the shakeup that is needed, you know, to keep sort of searching for better.
Awesome, thank you, Erin. So we do have 4 questions and 23 minutes left. So I kindly ask that we keep the questions or the answers a bit short. So the next question is from Allison.
Hi, so thanks so much for the great talk. I really enjoyed it. My question builds off of something that Erin mentioned about not having the data to actually look into these questions in the way we might want to. And I think there have been sort of improvements on that front, and a lot of discussions going on about how we measure it in public opinion surveys like the Canadian Election Study or other studies that are focused on these questions. But I was intrigued by the idea that collecting this data at the candidate level is something that's just haphazard and happens every election. And so my question maybe doesn't make sense, but I'm gonna throw it out there anyways. Are there examples of places where institutionally that data is collected by electoral management bodies, for example, filling out EDI forms when you register as a candidate, for example? And is that a solution that would be useful, or are official statistics like that in some ways, I wouldn't say dangerous, but have the potential to, activate that backlash, although it sounds like the backlash might not be a bad thing. But sort of, are there risks and advantages to institutionalizing that type of data collection?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, around the idea of data, like one of the arguments we hear even, for example, in universities or policing organizations, there's sometimes a push to collect racially disaggregated data. So we want to know, when police are stopping people, who are they stopping? Are they white? Are they racialized? And there's an argument for that if you have that data, then you're able to identify potential biases or prejudice. The argument that's made against it is that then we would, have data on who the actual offenders are, and maybe we don't want to know that. So there's often these two kind of opposing arguments made. You hear it. There's a push in universities now to collect data on the racial and gender backgrounds, as well, often income of applicants for universities, and then who is ultimately admitted, and in some cases what their performance is. And you hear a similar argument, well, maybe that would be good, but it's potentially dangerous too, that to have that data. And then there's also a sort of privacy concern about the state, maintaining a record of racial backgrounds. In Europe, it's done at the party level in some jurisdictions. In the United States, a non-governmental organization collects these data and is sort of institutionalizes it. In Canada, it's tended to be done by individual researchers. But one interesting thing is the Library of Parliament catalogs, collects, and reports data on the gender of candidates and members of Parliament, but they do not do that for race. And so to me, that's a really interesting, so it's okay to collect data on whether or not you're a woman, but it's not okay to collect data on whether or not you're white or non-white. And I've heard all kinds of different reasons for why that is, but I think that's I think it's just a very interesting reaction. I have heard from colleagues, though, that one colleague who did a survey and wanted to ask the racial backgrounds of respondents, and the University Research Ethics Board said that he was not permitted to ask questions about respondents' racial backgrounds because race is a social construct. Meanwhile, on that same survey, he asked the respondent's gender. So even within our own universities, there's this weird kind of reaction to collecting data on race that does not appear to exist for data on gender. And I think we need to pause and reflect on why that is.
Thank you, Erin. Erin mentioned a bit about the difference between Canada and the US on data collection. So Kassra, if you wanted to jump in for 45 seconds, if you have anything to add to that.
I mean, I have to be honest, on that front, that's beyond my expertise looking at candidates. So I will have to get back to Allison on that one.
Awesome, thank you. Henry, would you like to ask the next question?
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah. I have a feeling that you dismissed electoral reform, the effective electoral systems, rather too quickly. Obviously, it's not the only answer by any means. That in places like Canada, where you have some sort of residential segregation, so that in a first past the post system, you can have minority groups represented, sometimes fairly well. Obviously, it doesn't help women, for example, at all under our system. But even if you look at provincial electoral systems, residential segregation, it doesn't often do very much in terms of even minority groups, and the same thing in many countries. Now, why I think electoral reform is important is that it places the onus on representation of the minority groups of women and so on the political parties, not on the legislator who has to impose it on the population. It doesn't come from top-down government priorities, which lead to the kind of backlash that we've been talking about. If you take the countries that I know in Northern Europe, where there are list systems, it's very standard to have man, woman, or woman, man, and so on. And to make at least some effort more recently to make sure that there are positions on the list high enough up that minority groups are represented. It's by no means perfect, and it doesn't always work, but it means that the onus is on the parties, and the voters can punish the parties or reward the parties if they do that. What it seems to me here, what we're hearing is this is some kind, it's better to have it imposed from the top by government in this kind of selective way. I think that on balance, if you can avoid that through using electoral reform, I think you get much better results. Thank you.
I mean, you didn't ask a question, but I guess I would ask a question back, which is to say, I mean, why do you need electoral reform for that? You know, my perspective is electoral reform, yes, this could be fine, but parties use the absence of electoral reform as an excuse for not doing better. I 100% agree with you that the party is at the center of the answer. But if parties, even under our current system, were committed to nominating more women and more racialized and more diverse candidates in winnable ridings, we could very well achieve more representative institutions without electoral reform. And so, I mean, I don't disagree with you at all that the party is sort of at the heart of the solution, but the party could do this without changing our electoral system at all.
In theory, yes, but in practice, there's two problems with that. One is that if you want winnable ridings, you're going to have to take on incumbents. You're going to have to essentially say, well, too bad, it's time for a woman to run in your district. That doesn't tend to work very well. Secondly, this is basically saying to the parties, it's up to you. It's not giving them any institutional incentive to act. If there are lists, there's a built-in institutional incentive where they look very bad. If it's the top 10 positions are all men or all white men. So for those two reasons, I do think there's a difference between electoral systems if this is what we have in mind.
Sorry to jump in. I just want to contextualize this discussion for our audience and just clarify, we're talking about representation and first past the post system, correct? When we're talking about electoral reform?
Sure.
Proportional representation, sorry. Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah, and I mean, proportional representation, matter of fact is, I mean, we don't have it at the federal level in the United States. You know, it's a first past the post system. And when I talked about electoral system effects, there have been actually efforts of changing the electoral structure, going from these at-large kind of election systems to single member districts, and then drawing districts in a way in which you have majority minority districts or influence districts in which, let's say, 30 or 40% of the residents of a district come from one underrepresented ethnic or racial minority groups, where they can at least, in a first past the post system, can at least influence, if not their preferred candidate, who gets in has to listen to their wants and desires, because, you know, if they don't, come next election, they're going to get voted out. So these electoral system reforms are needed in the U.S. Through court cases that have been pushed down, and we have seen changes at the local level. But when it comes to parties, though, parties sometimes have an incentive, pervasive incentive, to keep the status quo. In the US, we have a two-party system. They're very entrenched, and they are in such control of the election system in terms of who can get on the ballot and what requirements they need, that they don't want to change anything and open things up to even third parties who may take more radical left or right decisions. So I guess in a multi-party system, maybe what you're saying could be more achievable, but in a two-party system in the United States with two entrenched parties that have so much control, it's very difficult.
I didn't use examples from the US, I should add.
Awesome. Thank you, Kassra, for your input. Erin, if you don't have any last words to add, we can jump on to the next question. Awesome. So the next question is from Samara, if you'd like to ask it.
Great, thanks. I think I have 2 points. One's a question and one's more of building off what Erin said in terms of data availability in the Library of Parliament. It's interesting because I think gender was actually added 2 years ago. Before that, gender was not even available. But another variable that is quite interesting and one that makes me question why race cannot be there is that they do actually have a variable about country of birth. And it is available for most. It's not complete, but it's pretty good to complete. So they have place of birth, and I don't think it's the best proxy for race, obviously, but I think it gets there. It's close enough, and I haven't seen any study that has actually used place of birth to see if there's differences there. But if they can have that, then why can't they have race? I think that those are very similar. But my question is actually one that I think Elizabeth talked about a little bit earlier, and that's that legislators face a lot of obstacles once they're in Parliament. I was wondering if you can talk a bit to this a little bit more in terms of what types of obstacles would legislators face by gender? So are there specific obstacles that women face once they are elected and in office that men do not necessarily face? Or put differently, do women have, or women legislators, do they have a higher standard to fulfill to be re-elected than men? Legislators once they are elected to office. So I'm wondering if there is some sort of bias once they've gotten over the first hurdle of being elected in the first election.
Yeah, thank you. Those are good questions. I don't have probably full or like even really great answers, but so there are some like obstacles for women as a group, I think, related to some of the points I was making. So this is some of the challenges of combining like care duties with parliamentary work, which is why there's a focus on adjusting the ways that parliamentary work is done and also the times in which it's done. So, I mean, if you look, if you've ever looked at like analyses worldwide, there's not many, but like of the ages, the average ages of parliamentarians and stuff, like often, you know, you'll find that the average age of women is older than men. And there's lots of reasons for that maybe, but one of them is the delay of parliamentary careers or legislative careers by women, because it would be so difficult to combine with, you know, having a young family or being pregnant or something. Although women do it and women should do it. I mean, you know, Parliament can be adjusted to accommodate that. And then there are some other types of, I mean, I would call them obstacles, but maybe we could call them differences. So like, to give an example, increasingly as parliaments have realized the need to become more inclusive, you know, there's been a lot of focus on appointing women and racialized members and Indigenous members to committees. And so, you know, there's a greater committee burden on some women. I mean, we see this in, speaking of parallels with like academic departments or other workplaces, right? Like all of the equity work that women and other marginalized groups do in their departments, well, that's replicated a bit in parliamentary settings. It's especially so when we look at, or not especially so, but it also goes to the cabinet level as well, right? Where when you don't have parity in cabinets, but yet there's a focus in committee work on having equality across men and women members, it means that women end up chairing, in some cases, more committees or being on more committees or having to do all of this extra work. So, I mean, I don't know if that's the sort of thing that you had in mind, but I mean, those are some of the obstacles that I see beyond the other things that I was talking about earlier too, around, you know, backlash and toxicity and gendered and racialized toxicity in politics.
I'd also like really love to see more research on what happens when politicians screw up and whether or not there are gendered and racial differences and sort of the penalty that's applied to them. So, you know, can politicians who've made mistakes sort of rise from the ashes again? And are there differences in who's able to make mistakes and still, you know, make a comeback and get over that? And, you know, there is some evidence in business that women CEOs who, you know, whose companies become less profitable, like they have a higher fall from grace and more difficulty sort of like recovering from that. And I'd like to see that. Yes, I'm curious to know if that's if that occurs in politics as well.
Awesome, thank you, Erin. And just to go a bit off script, I know Equal Voice did a bit of research on this, and women in the House of Commons tend to be more heckled because of their gender, and used to have like, are used to having kind of gendered targeted heckling. So I won't be surprised, to Erin's point, if they kind of see more severe consequences to their political decisions, unfortunately. So last but not least, we do have 4 minutes left. I'll direct it to Benjamin to ask his question.
Last but not least, you're putting a lot of pressure on me there.
Yeah.
not to be least. Anyway, I will try to keep this short in the interest of time, which is honestly not my forte. Just before I get to the question, I just wanted to comment. I came to Canada from the US about 15 years ago. And one of my observations was that it was very hard to get Canadians to talk about race. They were completely comfortable, and here I'm lumping, especially like my students, in particular, they're very comfortable talking about immigrants, immigrants, new Canadians, absolutely, but not visible minorities, not racialized groups, and there was typically an effort, sort of a reflex to conflate immigrant with racialized minorities. And I think that's very common in Canada, perhaps less so now. Okay, but my question really gets back to, I think, some of the earliest discussions about descriptive representation, but I think it's something that's been touched on by all the panelists, and then in a sense by Henry's question as well. That when we're talking about descriptive representation, you're talking about the identity of representatives, the identity of candidates. And of course, one of the real problems there is that you run into questions of authenticity. Well, is that person, really Black? Is she, well, less so with gender, but particularly with ethnic candidates? Well, they really, representatives of the South Asian community. So in other words, are they really, and again, of course, there are empirical, you can look at sort of empirical relationships between identity and substantive representation. However, it seems if I'll sort of bang the drum I've been banging for a long time. If you look at constituencies, if you think about representation in terms of the diversity of constituencies, some of those problems go away. And this gets to some of the comments that Kassra were making about the U.S., Where if you have a district where there's a substantial proportion of a racialized group or an ethnic group, whether that's a majority or effective plurality or simply an influence, in a sense, by definition, whoever is represented, whoever is elected from that constituency is going to be representative of that group's interest, regardless of their identity. So it's a way of kind of avoiding, I think, some of the fraught discussions about identity that you run into with descriptive representation. However, and this is what's come out, you know, that strategy I think obviously works better for racialized groups or ethnic groups than it does for women, because women are integrated at the household level. So I guess the question I wanted to pose, if to the panelists, if you had a magic wand and you could implement electoral reform, that is, you could implement proportional representation in Canada and or the United States, would you do that? Or would you pick a different big change to use it's a one-use magic wand? So proportional representation or something else? And I've left you 30 seconds.
I mean, I probably wouldn't with my magic wand. I don't know what I would do instead. I think I would save my magic wand to do something else, because I think there are places where greater intervention is needed that can't be addressed through other means. And for me, you know, you can achieve some of the same things that you could achieve through proportional representation through, like I say, parties just doing what they should be doing and not and as pressuring parties to do that. I would save my magic wand for something else.
Kassra?
Yeah, I mean, I always think about proportional representation. You know, if we truly had that, does it fix some of the underlying issues when it comes to policy? When we're talking about the difference between minority and majority groups, and majority group that, you know, has been in the context of US at least in power since the inception of this country. So I always, you know, we think about, you know, you do need sympathetic legislators on the other side of the aisle too, who are part of the majority group to bring about substantive policy changes. Without that, it becomes very difficult, because even if you had proportional representation, you know, let's say in a state, you know, where African Americans could be 20% of the population, you know, and they get 20% of the seats, you know, in a status quo system of American politics where things are so difficult to change. So you not only have to change proportional representation, but you have to also make it easier to bring about change in the US in terms of the rules of the game once legislation are proposed and what's the voting threshold. And so what I would say, I would use a magic wand, do proportional representation, give me another magic wand. We're gonna do multi-party system too, to make it even more difficult for, you know what I mean? To make it so different factions could come together on certain issues and overpower one particular faction across a range of policy issues. So I will take Erin's wand, since she didn't use it, use mine and do both.
I was gonna say you can borrow my magic wand.
Awesome. Elizabeth, you're shaking your head. What would be your answer to this question?
Oh, I'm not shaking my head in disagreement. I'm shaking my head at the person who gives away a magic wand. I mean, I wouldn't use it for proportional representation, but like, I mean, like full proportional representation could never, I don't think politically could never be possible in Canada. So you're talking about a mixed system. And you know, the women and the minorities would all be on the party list component of the system and therefore would face the same stigmas as though they had been elected by a quota. So I would actually, I guess, just use my wand for quota laws or something in the hopes that eventually institutional change will lead attitudinal change and help address some of the problems, I guess. Or I'd use my wand to eliminate parties because they're like the mafia of, you know, political selection and recruitment, and, you know, break the stranglehold somehow. I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question, but yeah, it wouldn't be for like pure PR, I guess.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your answer. And so that will be the end of our discussion today. Thank you all for sticking around and for asking great and passionate questions. And now I'll turn it over to Ruth.
And I'll turn it right away to Frédéric. Frédéric's going to have the last word here.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. The goals of this two-day conference were to, of course, provide an opportunity to discuss academic research done by some CSDC members, but also to engage into a broader discussion on the themes of diversity. And so that was the purpose of the roundtable this afternoon. I want to acknowledge our moderator, Ahmouda, the participants at this roundtable, Elizabeth, Erin, and Kassra. We really appreciated your participation today. And of course, I also want to thank the organization committee of this two-day conference, Erin Herlick, Ruth Dassonville, Jean-François Godbout de McGill et l'Université de Montréal. Merci beaucoup pour le travail que vous avez fait au cours des 2 dernières années pour cette conférence qui initialement était prévue en 2020. Mais voilà, 1 an plus tard, elle a eu lieu. Finally, I want to invite you to attend the next event of the CSDC. Many of you know Stuart Soroka, who used to be professor of political science at McGill University. He was one of the very first members of the CSDC years ago. Stuart is now professor of communication at University of Michigan. And apparently he has very good news for us. The title of his presentation on Friday, May 7th is The Increasing Viability of Good News. So from someone who wrote a book about negativity in politics, that sounds to be a very promising presentation. So this is in 2 weeks from now. In the meantime, I wish you a great end of the semester and enjoy the weekend. So thank you everyone, and we'll see you very soon. Merci beaucoup.